Karibu tena mtazamaji, na shukrani kwa kuendelea kusalia nami kwenye sehemu hii ya pili ya jarida ambayo tutakuwa tunazamia mazungumzo ndani ya muda usiokuwa mrefu. Lakini kabla ya kuzamia kwenye mazungumzo siku ya leo, turejee kule kwenye ukumbi wa Bomas ambapo mazungumzo ya maridhiano yamerejelea vikao vyake mapema hii leo katika ukumbi huo wa Bomas hapa Nairobi. Katika kikao kilichoanza asubuhi, baadhi ya mawaziri walipewa fursa ya kutoa hoja zao kwa kamati hiyo. Hebu tuvuke huko moja kwa moja.
Just present and say that every year our deficit within the year has increased, say for 2021, 2022, 2022, 2023, where we had a negative 16% and a negative 5%. 2014, 2015, we had a 99% increase in deficit from 367 billion to 732 billion. The year we are talking about 2022, 2023, 2024, this current financial year, as per the supplementary budget published last week but one, we already have a 20% increase in the deficit from 720 to 864 billion. Unless we rein in the deficit problem, we will still continue to run with a public debt problem that we are unable to manage. And this is important because when you look at the trend, these are changes that happen within the year. Mr. Chairman, if our revenues are not performing, why should our expenditures increase? Why don't we rationalize our expenditures? I want to confirm to this honorable team that I don't think we have a revenue problem. Every year our revenues have been growing year on year, an average of 10%. We have a spending problem. And somebody who is struggling with Fuliza, Tala, branch does not need more money. Needs a behavior change. And therefore it is important for us to rein in. Because what we are doing is that we are borrowing more and more and more. But where are we borrowing from? When you look at our debt currently, it's at about 50% each in terms of domestic to external. The debt servicing that we are paying, just one step behind, that whereas our debt is big, our biggest risk exposure is within the domestic market. Mr. Chair and co-chairs, I think this is a matter that we are not having a conversation on. This year alone, we expect to raise a revenue of about 2.5 trillion Kenya shillings. Let me bring it down. We expect to raise about 250 shillings in ordinary revenue. Our consolidated fund services, which includes pensions and constitutional expenditure, is 200 shillings. I'm just using average, it's 2.078 trillion. Out of that, our debt repayment is 1.86 trillion, 186. So do the math, 250 minus the 200, which these are non-discretionary expenditure. So basically, it's a must pay, it's a must spend. Of that 180, 100 is to the domestic market. Now, why is the domestic market important? It is because a lot of that borrowing has been on double digit. 12%, I think the last coupon I saw was at about 15%. In other words, we are highly at risk because with all that money being held by government, what it has done is that government basically is competing with private sector, with private individuals in the domestic credit market. That is important because when you read the story of what has happened in Greece, in Argentina, recently in Ghana, then it is the domestic market, the famous haircuts, were taken in the domestic market. But why is it important? If you have only, and if you add appropriations in aid, it's another 400 billion. So basically 290 shillings in my simplified figure. What you're saying is that teachers alone will cost you 400 billion. In other words, if you just add teachers' salaries to the consolidated fund services, all the money in ordinary revenue is gone. You've not even paid for military costs. You have not done transfers to devolution. And therefore, I want to suggest to this honorable committee that we have a debt crisis. And it is important that for us to have part of this national dialogue is perhaps to start having a conversation on how do we restructure, I'm avoiding the word default, how do we manage ourselves out of this situation because we do not have money to provide public services. And we have tried to analyze, because when you look at expenditure in social services, you look at expenditure to county governments in terms of the transfers we are making to county governments, everything is on 0%. It's only debt servicing that is on a higher upward trend. We have a crisis. And the earlier we accept we are in a crisis, they say the first step, after denial is acceptance. We need to accept that that is where we are. Because if we don't have this conversation, and it's interesting that the former Greek minister, Minister of Greece for Finance in Greece, has written an interesting paper, and he said one of the biggest problems is that they kept denying that there was a problem until finally, in fact the paper is called The Denial of the Greek Debt Problem. We cannot continue to say that we are sustainable. We are not sustainable. If we are to provide, something we'll have to give, and it's either public services or how we organize. I think I've executed that matter to the best, because as long as public services will suffer, otherwise we have to borrow more, because this deficit that we have now increased to 864 billion, where do we expect to get the money from? We have to borrow more. High taxation. As a result of the kind of situation we have, where the space, the fiscal space we have is limited, you then have to raise taxes. But who are you raising these taxes from, I beg to ask? Including the housing levy, which I still don't understand the concept. And I consider myself among the Kenyans who read public documents, perhaps more voraciously. And I still don't understand why you are taking more money from people for a concept. 80% of Kenyans, and this is the only thing I'll say on housing, live in their own homes. Have you asked them the kind of housing they need? I rest it there. High taxation, therefore, because of the situation we find ourselves in, the only option left is to raise more taxes. Is to raise more taxes. And when you raise more taxes, the group that you are targeting is only two kinds of individuals or legal persons. Is a corporate institution, a business entity, premise that is registered and that is providing a public service. Providing a good to the public, and therefore they purchase it, or an incomed citizen. That incomed citizen also has to pay taxes in terms of VAT, because income even includes the person who gets 100 shillings, in terms of their daily. And therefore, when we are thinking about taxes, would it be time to actually rethink the speed at which we are introducing taxes in a context where even the business environment is shrinking and incomes are not necessarily growing? I think here is a pacing question. And what do we introduce? Can you introduce all these taxes at the same time? But let me speak to the one on energy, because that is a critical one. Here, you have diesel that, of course, drives a lot of the IPPs in terms of energy, and I really thank Mr. Chirchir here, because he's really explained quite well. But that diesel already had been charged a tax, so almost one could argue, are we going through a situation of double taxation? But when you look at the taxes, and we did outline, just in the pump, and the EPRA has really provided. You have excise duty, you have road maintenance levy, you have petroleum development levy, you have petroleum regulatory levy, you have railway development levy, you have anti-adulteration levy, merchant shipping levy, import declaration fee, and value-added tax. And when you work out those numbers, you find that out of the 217, for instance, you will pay at the pump, 80 shillings of that is taxes. Wouldn't this be the best place, for instance, to say, given the situation we are in currently, can we pause? Can we give a rebate? Well, because why should the cost always be transferred to the consumer? Can it be the other way around? To say, can we give a pause to some of these taxes because of the state? Because we are talking about cost of living. Now, all this is compounded in the fact that in October, from the statistics again we have, 13% transport, there was a 13% increase in transport costs in terms of inflation. So that tells you that 13% in terms of increase, in transportation costs gets transferred to all our institutions. Finally, and perhaps to an animal that we have not given a lot of attention, I want to present that if we are going to manage the cost of government and the cost of living right now, we have to make a decision on what to do with state-owned enterprises. 25 to 28%, and I'm using that figure because we are to confirm for now, is of MDA's expenditure is by state corporations. Those state corporations, the last count we have made, they are at about 248 of them. These are not the 48 county governments, neither are they the 22 ministries at the national level. These are institutions, some doing duplicate work in different ministries, 25%. Now, this, when you go to the budget, is also the space where we don't have very much transparency about what goes on. We only find figures when there is need for a bailout for Kenya Airways. I'm giving an example because it's the one, for instance, in the supplementary first budget here has an increase of 1.7 billion in guaranteed debt to Kenya Airways. It's in the books. And during the review, the stock risk exposure, according to the BPS 2023, during the review period 2022-2023, the stock of risk exposure is estimated at 2.7 trillion, where 2.66 trillion is from state-owned enterprises. This is from the National Treasury report. So in other words, you are stuck with many structures that give you the highest risk with the least transparency. If you ask me, Mr. Chair, co-chairs, I think if we are going to deal with the cost of living, let us action on matters of how do we manage debt moving forward, including dealing with the deficits. Let us make a very decisive decision. What do we do with taxation that has to do with fuel, because that is being translated to every part of the economy. And let us action. There is a whole report on merging, selling state-owned enterprises. In fact, I think PBO and Bwana Masinde is here, did an estimate that if you were to sell, if you were to privatize some of them, I think would make about 30 billion annually. I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rugo. I couldn't agree with you more on the subject of state-owned enterprises. But since all those state-owned enterprises are owned by the PS or the Cabinet Secretary of National Treasury, we will now give him the floor to tell us whether he plans to do something about them. And this is the beauty of this engagement and this dialogue, is that you have an opportunity to say what you have said to other institutions. Bilo has been very well heard in the media, and now he can be heard by Kenyans, and the CS can hear him. Both CS National Treasury and Energy. So, Professor.
Thank you very much, members and the co-chairs and everybody else who is listening. It's actually a very informative debate, which actually can push me even to ask questions. But I will make sure that I don't do that. The DNA in me will be suppressed. The DNA in me is that I'm a teacher. So I would suppress that, Your Excellency. You already are familiar with that. But I wanted to find out, I want advice from you, Your Excellency, co-chair, and Wanakimani Shunga, the co-chair. Should I first of all comment on what has gone through, or should I first of all do I had some written submission on the 3 areas that I was asked to talk about. But I'm also they also interlinked with some of the issues that have come up.
Yeah, I think the best, my view, Kimani may have a different view, is you please make your presentation.
Okay.
And then after that comment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Without necessarily repeating what has already been said.
Okay. I will not repeat what has been said. Let me start off, and I think the statement I started with was on the cost of living and also related issues to that. And what I did was to prepare some responses that would actually try to explain where we are. Because I think, I'm sorry to say that sometimes when we find ourselves in a problem, we start thinking that that problem has just emerged. It has been there. It is the problem that we failed to arrest the problem that we find ourselves in the same problem. So, in fact, when I looked at this, I said, yes, it is important for us to look at the cost of living. But also, we have to also ask ourselves, how is it computed? How does it come about? Why are we beaten twice by this problem? And it has come up several other times. So that in this presentation, I want to look at the cost of living. I want to look at the implications of the Finance Act 2023. I also want to look at the implications of what has come so severally on the removal of any taxes, levies, and charges to cushion Kenyans against high cost of living and the attendant cost to the economy. Let me start off with the cost of living. Honorable Chair, co-chairs, let me start by defining the cost of living. And this is the amount of money that people need to spend in order to buy the basic goods or services such as foods, clothes, and payment for, especially and even in terms of where they live. I think Abraham has used that as trying to define who is below the poverty line. But the poverty line is actually composed of a survival kit. So it could be different, but it's something that we can come back to. And the cost of living is often used to compare how prices of goods and services have changed over time, over a period of time, and given the area, or in a given area, but more importantly, how expensive is it to live, is it computed or is it shown in terms of to live in a particular area versus another. That's why you find that we have we have a basket of goods that are measured every month, and every 3 months there's a survey for different cities in the country, and 3 different categories of people: higher, medium, and low income basket of goods. So it's computed as an average of that. But what are the factors that drive the cost of living? First is to understand that the cost of living is actually measured through the Consumer Price Index, and it is reported every month by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And the cost of living, the Consumer Price Index is actually used to measure inflation by tracking the changes of the prices by the consumers in the targeted basket of goods and services over time. Inside that basket, there are tradable goods. Inside that basket, there are non-tradable goods. I'll come back to that to try and explain what is happening in the 2 categories of tradable goods and the non-tradable goods. They have different effects, especially when it comes to nominal exchange rate movements. And even before I leave that, the non-tradable goods will drive the real exchange rate, while the tradable prices will mimic the exchange rate movements. Honorable Chair, co-chairs, as you may be aware, inflation rate has remained above the government range of 5.25, let's say 5% and 2% radius or diversion from both sides. That is 7.5% and 2.5%. That range, above that range means, especially a high, it means that inflation is high. It's in a regime of high inflation. And this is from June 2022 to June 2023. And that means that you can actually argue that the cost of living was high during that period. The policy range is well defined between around 5% and 2% on the other side. And we do believe that when it is below the 2.5%, we believe that it's deflation. And when it's above, it's high inflation, above 7.5%. And this is mainly as a result of commodity prices, especially food and fuel. And this has come due to multiple shocks. And so many people have talked about those multiple shocks. The biggest problem of shocks is that, especially from the supply side, is that we don't have solutions from the supply side. You have to bring back the supplies. But if you don't have the supplies, then you also have to take measures to bring to reduce the price level. And those measures sometimes, or most of the times when it's purely supply side effects, they induce the economy into a recession. And you can imagine a combination of recession and inflation is what we used to call it stagflation. Let me give you an example. If food prices are rising because there is no food, the only solution is to bring food into the market. Otherwise, prices will continue rising. If you're constrained by using the demand side tool, that is, you tighten monetary policy, what you are doing is that you are actually trying to dislodge the plateau of high prices in future, but otherwise you have not solved the scarcity value problem. So we have a scarcity problem. And we have so many people have repeated the crisis we have gone through. It's a layer of multiple crises. In fact, what I actually argue that you have crises that are persistent. Most of the time we believe that crises will be short-term. They will peter out. But these are persistent. It means that they create a permanent effect or a structural effect. And you have seen that in, especially during the COVID time, the Ukrainian crisis, the ravaging drought, all these are persistent shocks. And so they create a heavy impact in terms of food scarcity and the scarcity value license. But of course, at the end of the day, when we thought we had gone through this, then obviously there was tightening monetary policy in the advanced economies. For many years, we thought that the quantitative easing would be prolonged. But of course, we are paying the price that heavy liquidity in the market since or after the global financial crisis, we are paying for this. And that's why you find that the US continue to tighten monetary policy. In fact, even now, as of 2 days ago, we were discussing and everybody argued, and including in the US Secretary to the Treasury, told us about 3 weeks ago that their core inflation is still high. If core inflation is still high, it means that their interest structure will continue to be high. Ours is not core inflation which is high. Ours is the inflation that is coming from food and fuel effects, which is transmitted to us because we are importing a lot of food. There is a scarcity value. Fuel prices are rising, and of course, it's also exacerbated by the nominal exchange rate movements because domestic traded prices will mimic the movements in the exchange rate. Now, we rely very much on the